Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new TEAM therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Now, today, this is episode 29, and we have something a little bit new in our podcast. We have recorded a live session with a client, and David, you will talk a little bit about him in a moment. And we are going to spend the next several episodes doling out that session in segments, and we're going to comment on each of those segments to kind of explain what went on. And I think that will give people a better sense of how to conduct a session, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And this session was conducted not just with you, David, but we had a very, very good therapist with you, Jill Levitt, who really brought a lot of richness to the session and a little bit of a feminine touch, which I think was nice.
Absolutely.
So I think that people are really going to enjoy this. And so I don't know exactly how many episodes we'll have on this, but just enough to break down the session. So today we're going to listen to the testing part of the session, so the T in the TEAM-CBT model. And before we get into the session itself, I would like to introduce Jill, and this is a little piece that I recorded on the day of the session, a little bit of an interview so that our listeners can know who they're going to be listening to. Hi, Jill. So glad to have you on the podcast today, and I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. First about you so that we can introduce you to our listeners, and also about the session that we're about to broadcast in the next several episodes. So if you could tell our listener a little bit about who you are and how you came to be part of this.
Thanks, Fabrice. I'm glad to be here. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I have been doing cognitive behavioral therapy for almost 20 years since graduate school. Mm-hmm. And I actually moved to California about 9 years ago, and having already trained a lot in cognitive behavioral therapy, when I moved here, I actually looked up David Burns and contacted him because I really wanted to continue to learn and train and do some case consultation with him. And he invited me to join his ongoing Tuesday training group. And so about 9 years ago, I started attending as a trainee, and then I moved to a kind of small group leader, and now I co-lead the Tuesday team therapy training group with David Burns at Stanford.
We can really see that you're one of David's most advanced students, and from personal experience, I can see that you're extremely skilled. So,
thank you, Fabrice.
Like first-hand experience, you've done the session with me, which was just tremendous.
Thank you, and I so appreciate that. I honestly, training and learning and doing co-therapy with David is absolutely a highlight of every week for me. And really, having been inspired by David, myself and two other colleagues formed the Feeling Good Institute in Mountain View, California. And so I am the director of training there, which means that I kind of oversee the workshops and webinars and online training groups that we do. We all feel really inspired by David and just passionate about training other therapists and doing TEAM-CBT and really trying to provide high quality treatment as well as training to therapists.
And I want to add to this that, as much as we're kind of propagating the TEAM-CBT model through this podcast, and this is, accessible all around the world, your training is also accessible around the world because you do some online groups, correct?
That's right. So I do a lot of free webinars, actually 1-hour free webinars for therapists on a variety of TEAM-CBT topics dealing with resistance or methods or empathy training, and then also run weekly online training groups, really modeled after David's training group that's so inspiring. And this is so that people who are not local, in the Palo Alto or Northern California area can receive the same kind of training online.
Yeah, right. Not everyone is able to attend the Tuesday group, so I think this is a tremendous resource.
Thank you.
Can you just jump in here with a
No,
little
you can't.
infomercial, because Jill doesn't like to promote herself, but Jill is, I think, one of the finest psychotherapy teachers in the United States, if not the world, and the webinars that you offer are for small groups of therapists, 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 max, who can do personal work in the weekly groups and get the kind of training to really learn the techniques we demonstrated. And it's one thing to be inspired by hearing a wonderful session and seeing somebody change before your very eyes, but it's another thing to do it in a real world situation where you don't have mentors there to show you what to do, and to learn it at that level does require to have a weekly training group where you can practice and get feedback and really hone your skills, and you can't do better than getting that kind of training from someone like you, Jill. I'll shut up and let you guys go back.
Thank you for the infomercial.
Thank you. I'm blushing now.
It's a good thing that they can't see on
You can't
audio.
see me, but I'm blushing.
So let me ask you a little bit about the session that our listeners are about to witness. Can you say a little bit about your internal process, what goes on in your mind as you're conducting the session?
Sure. I think David has mentioned that we have a really wonderful kind of outline in our minds that we're aiming to work through: the testing, the empathy, the agenda setting, and the methods. And so although I know each of these steps really well and always practice it, it's still something that I'm kind of constantly referring to as I'm working with a patient.
Yeah.
And it keeps me anchored and on track, and it keeps me from jumping in too quickly with methods. I have similarities to David in that we both are very kind of aggressive and excited to use powerful methods with patients, and we don't like to spend a lot of time schmoozing. And so for me, it's actually holding back and making sure that I'm really offering, in this case, our patient Mark and all patients, adequate empathy, and then really dealing with the resistance before kind of moving to powerful methods.
Yeah, which is certainly something that we keep repeating on the podcast, which is the most powerful part of the TEAM-CBT model. Now, when you start the session, Mark shows up with a completed mood survey.
Right.
And we'll have a snippet of it on the show notes. And I noticed that you use that to kind of get started on the empathy, right?
Right. So we check in with Mark, and we oftentimes kind of read back to him what we see on his form in terms of what his symptoms are of anxiety and depression. We think of the brief mood survey almost like when you go to see your physician and they take your temperature or your blood pressure. It's like a reading that we do in the very beginning of the session, and that is the way that we get started. I can't claim to be able to mind read or know exactly how my patient's feeling, and so the brief mood survey, looking at it and going over it in detail with the patient, helps me to connect with them and to kind of anchor us and understand exactly how they're feeling right now in this moment.
Yeah. One thing that I noticed and that the listeners won't be able to see is that while Mark was answering your questions, you were taking copious notes.
Right.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think that is something that I probably did some of that before meeting David Burns, but I think he's really encouraged that a great deal. This idea that there's just like so much richness in what your patient says to you. And I try to write down as much as what I'm hearing. So Mark was even saying during the empathy phase a number of negative emotions he was describing to us, feelings of shame and inadequacy. He was also saying some negative thoughts like, I think that I'm a failure. I think there's something wrong with my brain. And so if I didn't write those things down right as he was saying them, I honestly think I'd forget them, or I'd be paraphrasing and not really doing justice to Mark's experience. So I do try to take copious notes actually during my therapy sessions with patients.
Aren't you concerned that you may lose eye contact with your patient while you're doing this?
I can honestly say I do know a lot of therapists are worried about that. I do have therapists that say, "Oh, that's kind of weird," and don't you think you're not maintaining eye contact, or you're going to look too mechanical? I think the proof is in the pudding, and I haven't had that experience with patients. I can tell you honestly, I haven't had patients complain about my taking notes during sessions. I think quite the contrary. When I repeat back to a patient just what they've told me and their words or their emotions, I think they're more kind of blown away by the accurate empathy. And I think that would compensate for any discomfort with note taking. It doesn't feel, it takes some practice probably for therapists who don't take notes during their sessions, but it doesn't feel uncomfortable to me at all. And I feel quite close and connected to my patients.
That makes really good sense. I've had that experience myself, which has surprised me because I was used to not taking a lot of notes. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I noticed at some point in the session, you said that you were trying to fight the urge to rescue Mark. Can you say more about that?
Yes. I mean, I think probably a lot of therapists can relate to this, that, we're in this profession because we deeply care about our patients. And when you see a patient who's suffering, and in some level, sometimes you can see the solution, like with Mark when he was just talking about his feelings of guilt and how it was all his fault. There was part of me that wanted to say, it's not all your fault. There's all these other factors that could be related, right? Yeah. And yet I think that's really disrespectful. It's kind of doing the hard work for Mark. And I know in the end, it's not going to lead to the same kind of result at all. But it's hard because I'm all the while kind of aware in my mind of sometimes seeing solutions. And so I have to fight the urge not to say them out loud, but to wait and let the process unfold and let Mark find those solutions for himself. And the other thing, about rescuing, I guess, it's also just sort of, we feel that urge because we're compassionate. And yet it's also feels sort of disrespectful to the patient and patronizing to think that, that they're coming to me because I'm, so wise and bright. It seems sort of narcissistic to think that it's my role to rescue my patient rather than to sort of help my patient figure out how to help himself.
Yeah, this is very respectful of the people you're working with. So now that our listeners are a little bit more acquainted with Jill, David, maybe you want to say something about our client, Mark. How did he come to participate in this?
Well, a lot of times when I'm doing live demonstrations or making videos of them, the volunteer is a therapist.
Yeah.
Which is both good and bad. It's good because therapists are just like anyone else. There's a thin line between shrink and patient, really. Yeah. But sometimes people raise the question, well, how about working with a normal, type person who isn't a therapist? And this session gives us a great chance to work with someone who is not a psychotherapist. He's a physician, an OB/GYN physician. And a wonderful, warm-hearted individual who happened to be coming to my Tuesday training group at Stanford. Because
so he's familiar with your model.
He's familiar with the model, but he had an intense interest in learning improved communication skills because, as the listeners will hear, because of the problem he describes, a conflict with his older son that's been bugging him for decades, really, that he's been unable to resolve. But he's had a very dramatic life. He had to escape from his country of origin. Yeah. We'll learn in the empathy phase of the video how he was shot 5 times trying to survive during the revolution in his country, and
he goes into great details about what happened.
Made his way way to the United States, but he's a very down-to-earth individual. And although his problem is unique to him, you'll hear that he's feeling that he's been a failure as a father, especially in his relationship with his oldest son. The theme is universal. Your ethnic background, your religious background, the details of your life might be different, but most of the people that I've worked with in therapy, and most of the people I've known personally, have felt at some time that they were a failure in life, that not smart enough, not good enough. Failure as a mother, failure as a father. A lot of therapists say I'm screwed up as my patients. I'm kind of a fraud. This idea of beating up on yourself because of your shortcomings, that's really what this session is about, and how to escape from that particular trap. I think humans for thousands of years have been feeling depressed and anxious because you think you're not good enough, and so you'll hear the team strategy.
It is very universal, yeah. The segment we're going to hear today is the testing part, and you began with the brief mood survey and the positive feelings survey that Mark filled out, and we will have a copy of that sheet on the show notes at feelinggood.com. Do you want to say something about the process of filling this out? How does this work, and what did you do during that segment with what Mark filled out?
Sure. The brief mood survey is just a series of short, highly accurate assessments that show exactly how depressed a person is feeling right at this moment, how suicidal, how anxious, how angry. It tests positive feelings as well as negative feelings, and as well as satisfaction in intimate relationships. And the test is the patients fill it out before the session begins. When I was in clinical practice, I had them fill it out in the waiting room. And it takes them about a minute. There, you can have a clipboard and 100 blank ones there, and tell them to come to the session early and fill it out. And they hand it to you at the start of the session, and you can see exactly how that patient is feeling at the beginning of the session.
And that's pretty much what you did when Mark came in, and you handed him this blank survey, and he filled it out. And the survey, people will see that online. There's a before session and after session.
Yeah. Then when the session is over, you give it back to the patient, have them go back to the waiting room. In this case, he just did it in front of us, but it takes them about a minute to fill out the end of session ratings, and then they leave it for the therapist. And you can see for the first time, it's like having an emotional X-ray machine, exactly how effective or ineffective you were in every single session.
Yeah, and in fact, I have this survey right in front of me, and I will not give any spoilers, but there was a change between the before session and the after session.
And that's what you're looking for. This is really, I think, a revolutionary step forward in psychotherapy. It's exciting because when you have the data right at the end of the session, it's how effective you were. If you were effective, then you can do more of the same the next time you see the patient. And if you weren't effective, then you can talk it over with the patient and go in a different direction.
Yeah.
In an earlier podcast, we talked about the accuracy of therapists and knowing how they're doing, knowing how the patient feels. And I did a research study on this at Stanford, and in my study, the experts who were interviewing patients admitted to the Stanford inpatient unit were less than 10% accurate in their perception of just about everything about the patient. Their perceptions of depression were way off base. The suicidal urges was way off base. But therapists don't know that. Therapists wrongly believe that they know how patients are doing.
Yeah.
And when you get the actual quantitative data, it can be a shock and a surprise sometimes a pleasant surprise and sometimes a disturbing surprise. But it's just like when the X-ray machine came in, doctors then could see into the lungs far more accurately for the first time, and it revolutionized medicine. This is going to revolutionize psychiatry and psychology because you can see into people's hearts, their brains, with a great accuracy for the first time.
Thank you. Do you want to say something in particular about this particular testing phase of this session? One thing that I noted in there was that the scores on the negative part of the survey were not extremely high. You know, on the top of the scale in depression would be 20, same for the other scales, and it was nowhere near that. Anything that we should draw from this?
Well, it's just that, you know, Mark isn't, and we talked about this in the session, he isn't the kind of guy who you'd say, oh, you got to go to a psychiatrist because you're suicidal or severely depressed or whatever. The symptoms were kind of mild, except for, you know, one or two areas where they were severe, but for the most part, mild symptoms. But it's like running around with a low-grade fever all the time. You don't need hospitalization, but you're not very happy either because there's something eating away at you. And I think a lot of people are like that. There's something eating away. Oh, I had a divorce. My marriage was a failure, or I failed at this, or I'm not good enough at that, or something about you that feels kind of unfulfilled. And people like that need a little mental tune-up to get back to feelings of joy and self-esteem. And in Mark's case, this thing's been eating away at him for, you know, probably 30 years, 25 or 30 years. And it's great to be able to give someone the gift of joy. The gift of an engine tune-up can be pretty tremendous.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, without further ado, let's listen to that segment. And I just want to apologize a little bit for our listeners because this is kind of like a new recording setup for us, and we had a little bit of a background noise. But we'll work on the technology as time goes by. I think that for the experience, this will definitely be worth it for our listeners. Okay, let's listen to that.
We're grateful to you, Mark, for giving us this opportunity to do a real team therapy session. We talk about team. People talk about their approach to therapy, but people don't often get a chance to look behind closed doors to see what actually happens in a therapy session. And so that's why Jill and I and Fabrice are so grateful to you for volunteering to be the first person to make yourself vulnerable and do some real live work on audio. We'll just refer to Mark as Mark, and he is a physician. Also, I'm so proud and excited to be introducing my dear and highly esteemed colleague, Dr. Jill Levitt, is a clinical psychologist, and Jill first started attending the Tuesday training group at Stanford, and now is my co-teacher of that group, and we've worked together now for years doing co-therapy and workshops and the Tuesday group and teaching together, and it's a real joy to be working with you again today.
Thank you for having me, David. I'm excited to be here with you and Mark.
So let's dive right in. Before the session began, we're going to go over team therapy, TEAM, and that's the approximate sequence of what we do in a session. And the T stands for testing, and one of the unique features of team therapy is that we test the patient in multiple dimensions at the beginning and end of every single therapy session, so we can see if we've made a beneficial impact and And then at the end, Mark will not only take this test again so we can see are there changes in depression or relationship satisfaction or positive feelings or whatever, but you'll also be rating us on how empathic we were, how helpful we were, and various other important dimensions. And why don't you start us off here with the what Mark's testing shows?
Sure. So, Mark, I'd love to hear about what it is you're looking for help with today. You filled out this brief mood survey just now, and it looks like you've indicated that you're feeling somewhat discouraged or hopeless, and also you have a somewhat on low self-esteem, inferiority, and worthlessness. So you're feeling some symptoms of depression. And you also have some symptoms of anxiety here. You told us that you're feeling somewhat anxious, somewhat worried about things, and somewhat nervous. And the other thing here is a little bit of frustration. And you also, I'm just going over your scores here, you also we have a positive feelings survey, which is you have a score of 34 out of a possible 40. So you do have a lot of, high levels of positivity, feeling productive and motivated and hopeful and encouraged. What you have the lowest here is a feeling of connection to other people. And also you have some less than perfect scores on feeling worthwhile, feeling good about yourself, feeling close to people, feeling calm and relaxed. And then the last section here is relationship satisfaction. And you indicated here that you're filling this out with regard to your oldest son.
Correct.
And this is very low. This is the lowest of all the scores here, which is not surprising because you said you wanted to talk to us about something related to him. So you have a total score of 2 out of a total of 30. So 30 would mean feeling very satisfied with your relationship, and 0 is not at all. And you have a 2 here. So really low scores, feeling really dissatisfied on communication and resolving conflicts, degree of affection, closeness, and overall satisfaction.
Right.
Yeah. So I just said a lot here. I was just kind of summarizing your scores, but really I want to hear from you now about kind of what it is you're looking for help with, and maybe share more with us about these feelings of sadness and anxiety and disconnection.
And just one brief overview concept here is that your scores aren't showing, real severe depression or, what people would ordinarily go to a psychiatrist or psychologist for. The depression is kind of minimal, the anxiety's, minimal, the anger's minimal. The positive feelings are just, they're down a bit. But, and the problem with the sun looks very powerful, but the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of people who might be listening to this broadcast who maybe don't have the severity of symptoms that would be driving someone to say, I better take an antidepressant or go to a shrink or something. This would be like having a fever of 100, not 104. But it's still enough to rob a person of real joy in life. And there's a lot of people like that who are just feeling that there's something eating away at you that's preventing you from having real joy and a jubilant feeling about life and your connections to people and your own self-esteem. And so this is a topic I think that almost everyone potentially can relate to.
Well, good. That was very enlightening, David. So we just heard the testing phase, which was rather short compared to the next segment, which will be the empathy part. I imagine we'll do it in one shot, but it's a little bit longer, so we'll see whether we decide to split it. And so we'll gather again for the next episode.
Sounds good to me.
All right. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.